Chapter 13. Over on crowded Terra, the Druids were recovering from their first fury of surprise. Like Kian and Maha, Lucron and Lacrew were in no doubt as to whose hand had kindled the fire that blazed sacrilegiously into the dusk over on the Hill of Slain. On either side of Leary, they almost danced with rage and indignation at the challenge made so fierce in public. It is the Roman. No one else would dare to do this thing. Lacrew rolled his eyes to heaven and threw out his arms in a gesture of prophecy. It is the Roman, O my king, and unless this fire which you see be quenched this same night, it will never be quenched, and the kindler thereof will overcome us all and seduce all the folk of your realm. Leary turned and looked at him calmly, the only one of all the seething, wondering multitude who seemed neither to be surprised nor particularly upset by the sight of the red glow across the plain. Indeed, Labron, who was close beside him when they first came out, had surprised a slight smile on the high king's face and an expression very close to admiration, as if in battle he had found an adversary he thought worthy of his own mettle. "And how would you advise me, Lacrew, my man of magic?" he said. "How would you advise me to quench it?" Go now, the Druid cried, beating his hands together in alarm at the tepid reactions of the king. "Go now, O king, and answer this challenge at once. Bring the Roman to account that he dares thus to offer sacrilege to the sacred customs of our land. Face him, O Leary, with your wrath and might, and drive him once and for all from this land, or kill him else beside his unholy fire." Even if he had failed to rouse anxiety in the king, Lacrew had succeeded in whipping himself into a frenzy. He staggered a little as his voice screeched upward on the last words, and his face below his shaven head had taken on a strange blue pallor in the fading light. Small flecks of foam gathered at the corners of his mouth, and his knees sagged as if he was totally exhausted, too exhausted to care much for his victory when Leary answered him. "Order out the chariots," he said. We will do as my magician says, and answer this dangerous man here and now. Lacrew, Lucron, you are the generals of this battle. It will not be one for swords, if all I have heard of this Roman be true. Bring your followers and all your powers. I will take only my household and Kian, my champion, you at my side. Bring out the chariots, and we will go at once across the plain before darkness falls." Beside him, Lacrew did not appear to hear. He seemed shrunken into his robes, and he was shivering suddenly as if only at this moment he had felt the bitter wind, and the same cold pallor darkened around his mouth. The messengers fled to the stables with the king's command. Excitement winged their heels, and the wide green dusk still held the sky when a train of 9 chariots rumbled and thundered down the flank of the hill which led to the plain of Breg. In the front one rode Leary, and beside him Lacrew, huddled in his cloak. His eyes were vague and filmy, and for once indifferent to the weather, so that he paid no heed to the great mass of black cloud that was creeping slowly and steadily toward the Hill of Slain, spreading wide across the whole sky and filling the cold air with a threatening rumble of thunder. On Terra, the vast crowd still stood and watched, huddled in their cloaks, but oblivious to the weather, even though there was now nothing left to watch except the small, steady point of light on the far hill. Maha was no longer watching this. Her eyes strained after the chariot train until they were swallowed up in the tree shadows of the plain, and she had no thought for anything except the fair head of Kian rising above all the others in the chariot following the king. For the first time consciously, she prayed directly to her new god and begged him to bring the young warrior back safely to Terra. She did not even remember to pray for Patrick, who must necessarily have been in far greater danger. By the time the chariots reached the small slope of Slane, the evening looked as if it had been cut in two. Behind them to the west, Tara still stood clear and dark against the crystal sky, but beyond Slane, darkness had taken all the countryside. Thunder rolled and muttered like an angry beast that bellows for its freedom, and here and there the red fork of lightning split the black sky, lighting the darkness for one lurid second. At the foot of the hill of Slane, LaCruz seemed to make some effort to pull himself together. He stood up unsteadily in the swaying chariot and raised his hand. "Stop here, O king." He looked upward at the hill that now loomed close, so close that they could no longer see the fire at the top, but only the glow that hung red and threatening above the dark masses of the trees. "Stop here, my king," LaCruz cried, "and do not venture into the circle of his fire, lest he should overcome you by the power of his magic." Leary was a realist and an intelligent man. As the Church of Rome, he had been at pains to find out, but he was not proof against the lifelong teachings of the Druids and the religion he believed in. He too gazed uneasily at the rosy glow above the hill and bade his charioteer to halt. The following chariots swept up to form a circle around him, as if indeed it were to be a battle of swords and javelins. "Go no nearer, O king," LaCruz cried again, and his voice was thin and hoarse. "Bid the man come down here and speak with you and account for his actions." In the strange, eerie light of the divided world, faces stood out pale and troubled from the growing darkness. They waited loyally on their king, but their superstitious minds were already trembling with fear of the unknown, of the strange fire that lit the sky above their heads and the unearthly darkness of the storm-split cloud behind the hill. Leary stood up in all the colored splendor of his chariot and looked around the ring of ashen faces for a messenger. "Who will go for me," he said to them, "and bring this man?" There was a long, uneasy silence in which the thunder rolled and threatened, and frightened eyes turned upon each other, and no man offered. After a few moments, Cian leaped from the second chariot, and the storm light was almost green on his pale hair. He looked all around in contempt at the frightened faces of the men who would not move, most of them warriors trained. "I will go for you, my king," he cried. "Gladly I will go for you, and the Roman will come with me. Do not fear." Several of them took courage then and shouted out that they would go with him. He dismissed them with a gesture. "I will go alone," he cried, and did not look back at them, walking out through the chariot ring and across the stretch of grass to the gloom of the trees. Leary watched him, and one red eyebrow lifted to his hair, and he recalled with interest that he had sent this young man once before to deal with Patrick, and he had come back to say he found no reason for his death. He made no remark on this, but watched Cian vanish into the thick darkness, and then waited in silence and patience for him to come back, knowing without even turning his head of the trembling and the shaken terror that reigned all around him in the other chariots. By the four winds, he thought with contempt, what do they think the Roman can do to them when he is not even a Druid? But he was honest enough to acknowledge to himself that he had obeyed LaCruz at once, and when he told him not to go within the circle of the fire. The dense black cloud was now almost immediately above Slane, blotting the light from the sky as if it were a drawn curtain. Great drops of rain began to fall, blown in the rising wind, and now the lightning flared constantly over the ring of terrified faces. In the sharp flashes of sudden light, LaCruz looked as if he had been resurrected from the dead. So sharp and pallid was his face, with the sweat standing in glistening beads on his waxy skin. In a moment of uncanny silence, when the thunder ceased, they could hear the noise of Cian and the Roman's priest thrusting their way downward in the pitch darkness that now wrapped the woods. Almost before Leary knew of it, Patrick was before him, standing quietly outside the ring of shields and chariots, so that the clear light, which still hung to the west, fell on his face and blazed in the adze head of his bisphoric. Beside him stood a young boy whose bright eyes roamed in curiosity over all the strange scene before him and rested long on the bright figures of Leary and his queen. Keon did not return to his position in the chariot ring, but stayed outside it, standing with the Roman and the boy. To the already frightened eyes that watched them, they looked something more than mortal in the unearthly light of that strange evening, coming from the dark woods and standing there so still and silent. The bright-eyed boy and the bishop in his blaze of gold, and the tall young warrior with the green light tangled in his hair. LeCreux was the first to gather himself together, and it was easy for him to find his rage again, faced for the first time by the man who threatened all his inheritance of power. "Who are you, Roman?" he screamed, and his hand flew up to clutch his chest as though his anger hurt him, and the lightning lit the sweat that was running down his face. "Who are you that you dare to challenge the beliefs of Aaron and the orders and wisdom of its king?" The thunder dropped, and they could hear the thin whistling of his breath. "Who are you, and who is your authority? Answer, answer," the High King. The last words died away with an anguished gasp, as if the Druid had no breath left to shout with. Patrick answered in the words he used to Daishu, and all eyes were on his face, ignoring LeCreux, who clawed at his chest and struggled for his breath unnoticed. "I challenge your beliefs," the priest said, and he looked only at Leary. "I challenge your beliefs by the authority, my gracious God, whose ambassador I am in the land of Aaron." LeCreux lifted his agonized face and summoned his whistling breath. "A curse upon your God," he screamed. "A curse upon him and all." His words were lost and drowned in a massive roll of thunder and a blaze of purple lightning as the storm broke overhead. The last shred of light was extinguished by the black mass of storm cloud, with hail flailing down in white stinging torrents, rattling off the chariot's sides and lashing the horses until they reared and pranced and tore at their harness, terrified by the thunder that crashed overhead with the noise of 1,000 judgments. It was too much for the nerves of Leary's men, strained by their sacrilege of distant fire and terrified of this man who might command a magic stronger than their own. They did not stop to reason that such a storm had obviously been raging in the distance for many hours. One flaming fork of lightning split the thundering dark. To show them LeCreux, their magical defender with all the powers to keep them safe. Himself collapsed into a heap of sodden robes in the center of their ring. Beyond it, the Roman stood unharmed and tranquil, with the rain streaming down his lifted face as he thanked his God for the storm, which proved so good and opportune a weapon against magic and superstition. The men in the chariots waited for no more when they had slighted the dead LeCreux. Stricken, they were certain by the greater magic of the Roman. They forgot their king and they forgot their orders. They forgot that they were gathered in a circle and drove forward without thought for anybody else, lashing their horses into a frenzy. The quick, brief storm was passing, and there was no longer even lightning to give them help. In the pitch darkness, horse ran into horse, and chariot poles splintered like dried reeds. Wheel wrenched off wheel, and side panels cracked away in rending wood and the screaming of curses, while the terrified horses neighed and scrambled and trampled on the poor wretches thrown from the chariots in panic. "The king and queen!" cried Keon at Patrick's side, and vanished down into the noise and confusion. It was only a matter of minutes before the wild, freakish storm and darkness had come and gone. The space below the trees was strewn with bodies and the tumbled fragments of broken chariots heaped in the white glitter of the hailstones, while frenzied horses galloped away into the distance, their broken traces trailing behind them. To one side stood Leary with his queen, clinging to his arm. They were unharmed, having been in the center of the ring, so that the panic-driven chariots had collided with each other before they reached them. Water streamed from their hair and clothes, and the queen wept with fright. Even Leary looked pale, as though he held to his calm and dignity with an effort. Cian held the horses of their chariot, talking to them and soothing them into quietness. And in among their tangled wreckage, Lucron bent over the body of his fellow Druid. In a moment, he threaded his way over to the king, and he glanced at Patrick on the way with a mixture of terror and cold hate. "He is dead, O king." In silence, the eye of the king and queen turned on Patrick, and Bennett looked from one to the other, a little dazed and not really quite sure himself whether his beloved father had slain the Druid by magic or not. He was not concerned. In his own time, Patrick would explain it all, and he had no doubt it would be God's work. Leary dragged his fascinated eyes away from the priest and made an attempt to assert his position and be logical. "What killed him?" he asked. "Was he struck by a chariot?" "He is unmarked, my king, and he was there lying stricken before the chariots moved. I saw him." Leary was silent. He had seen him too, indeed. When on Lucran, he was stricken at the very moment that he saw the fire of sacrilege on this hill. "I saw this myself. It is magic, O king, evil magic that could reach across the plain and strike your Druid with the torch of death. It is magic that will destroy your land. Kill, O king. Your avenger is beside you. Bid him draw his sword." Cian turned his head sharply from the horses, but before he could speak, the queen rushed forward from Leary's side to throw herself down at Patrick's feet, indifferent to the cold of the long, wet grass where the hailstones lay thick and white among their roots. Her nerves were not as strong as her husband's or her Druid's. She had seen all she wished to see of this man's magic and the things that it could do. "Oh man," she begged, and lifted her clasped hands in supplication. "Oh man, righteous and mighty, do not destroy the king, for the king will come and kneel and worship thy Lord." The priest had stood unmoving and in silence above the chaos. Now he looked down at the kneeling queen, and his face was gentle. True dusk was coming now, and there was no light in the golden disk as he bent to rise her up. "You honor him," he said, "that you would so protect him, but make no rash promises on his behalf." He looked into her agonized and fearful face as he helped her to her feet with her sodden hair plastered flat and dark around her cheeks and the water dripping from her cloak. He thanked his God that the first weapon offered to his hand had been sufficient to capture the queen. This was a beginning. But when he looked at Leary over her bent head, he realized that the battle there was far from over, and that her promise of a subservient king was indeed a rash one. In the failing light, it was to be seen that Leary had pulled himself together, and his proud eyes showed no sign of bowing down to worship anybody's Lord, but they did show a cautious and calm appraisal of a man who faced him in the falling darkness. Like Bennett, he was not quite sure how they had been achieved, but the results of this man's work were plain here for everyone to see. He glanced once more at the carnage at the foot of the hill and the sprawled body of his dead Druid. "I care for no new gods," he said. "I am well pleased with the ones I have always known, but I bid you welcome to visit me in my palace of terror." By the side, Lucran swelled with fury. By his side, Lucran swelled with fury and opened his mouth to shout his objections, but Leary spoke again before he had found words. "There," he said, "you can dispute this all more fully with my Druids." The priest did not answer at once. His head bent as if grown suddenly weary under the weight of the golden disk. "I will come tomorrow," he said then. In his heart, he groped humbly for adequate words with which to thank his unfailing God, who with one wild storm and a sudden death had gained him the entry into Terra. On the hill, Maha had slipped away from her mother and the crowds that roamed about and talked and speculated and watched and waited, staring over the plain of the hill of slain, telling each other they could see this or that by straining their eyes into the evening shadows. The sudden blinding storm dispersed them to shelter, and Maha with them. But over Tara it had lost its violence and was quickly past, so that she could creep out again from Mycorta. She was there to listen on the fringes of the crowd when a word passed from lip to lip of the frantic horses stampeding home, trampling their broken traces and the shattered fragments of their chariots, one even dragging the terrible remnants of a driver whose foot had tangled in the leathers. Desperately, she stared in the growing darkness at the small, steady light on the hill of slain, and desperately now she prayed to her new God. Even as she prayed, she could not find the words to know if it were Kion or the Roman that she prayed for. Preparations were made at once to send out a party of warriors to search for Leary and his queen, but it was full darkness when pinpoints of torchlight heading for Tara across the plain raised the excitement of the watchers once again. Maha turned and lifted up the skirts of her blue gown, running for Cahir Croffin and slipping there into a place close in the shadow of the greatest gates. If it was the king, then he would come here, and also all those who were with him. She would be able to see them clearly in the torchlight about the gate, and close too, so that she could see if they were wounded or anything, or if they had taken Patrick as prisoner. In the blaze of light before the gate, she saw Kian perfectly, riding in the king's chariot. There was only one other left in all the chariots that had gone out, and in this one rode the queen. They were all sodden wet and much disheveled, and the queen looked pale and shattered and as if she had been weeping, while the king stared straight in front of him, but seemed to be seeing nothing. Beside him sat his avenger, even dirtier and more tattered than when he had fought through the masses in Mycorta. But under his wet, bedraggled hair, his face looked calm and happy, and a small smile touched his mouth. Now Maha was ready to go home. Satisfied, she slipped away into the cold night, and after a while she began to skip, exactly as she had done on that first morning so long ago when Seshnan had told her she was to come home. Small dancing steps that set the bright hair bobbling on her back, and soon needed a happy humming to keep them properly in time. She did not remember at the moment that she was promised to the God of Patrick.